The dog would not stop digging. Scout had his whole body committed to the mud at the bottom of Dead Mule Wash, hind legs braced, forepaws throwing black water in steady arcs, and he had been at it since the first gray light came up over the Alkali Basin. Nora Ellison called him off twice. He did not come. That alone stopped her cold, because in 6 years the dog had never once refused her. And when she came down the cut bank in the freezing dawn and saw what his paws had bared in the flood-scoured clay, a curved band of hand-forged iron, a spoke, the rotted rim of a wooden wheel that no one had made in 100 years, she stopped breathing the way he had taught her to stop breathing when something mattered. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and follow it all the way to the end. We read every single comment, and we want to know how far this story travels tonight. Sergeant First Class Nora Ellison had been living out of a 28-foot camper on the edge of that wash for going on 11 months, which most of Alkali Springs, Arizona, considered proof of exactly the kind of person she was. A drifter, a squatter, a woman who talked to her dog more than to people. What the town did not know, because Nora had never once offered it, was that the 11 acres she was parked on had belonged to her family for 130 years. A patented placer claim her great-great-grandfather had filed in 1893. The deed folded in a Ziploc bag in the camper's cupboard. The last thing she owned that still had her name on it, and no one else's. She was 39 years old, though the desert and the years had added a decade to her hands. She was lean and unhurried, medium height, with sandy hair she kept cut short and shoved under a faded ball cap, and a way of holding still that made new people uneasy, without knowing why. There was a puckered scar low on the left side of her neck, where a fragment had gone in and a surgeon had gone after it, and the way she turned her whole body to look at a thing, instead of just her head, was a habit she'd brought back from the war and never lost. Her eyes were a flat desert hazel, patient and unblinking, the eyes of someone who had learned to wait out sandstorms and firefights and grief with the same economy of motion. The eyes of a woman who had looked at hard things and decided, a long time ago, not to look away. She was not cold. She was simply finished performing warmth for people who hadn't earned it. She moved through the world with the quiet, coiled economy of someone who had nothing left to prove and knew exactly what she was still capable of. She had enlisted at 21 and deployed to Kandahar in 2012 on a cultural support team, one of the women the Army attached to Special Forces to do the work male soldiers could not do in that country, searching, questioning, sitting on dirt floors with mothers while the Odo worked the compound. She had gone back a second time and come home with a bronze star with a V device that she never explained to anyone. Later, when the regiment finally opened its doors, she had gone through the qualification course and Robin Sage and earned the Green Beret herself, one of a small number of women to do it, and served with 3rd Special Forces Group until an eyed outside a nothing village put steel in her neck and cracked 2 vertebrae and ended it. The Army retired her at 36. The marriage went not long after. The savings went to the lawyers. And somewhere in the long, quiet slide that followed, Nora Ellison had come home to the one piece of ground that was still hers. And stopped, the way a soldier stops at the last defensible position and decides this is far enough. She had Scout. That was the truth of it. Scout was a 6-year-old German shepherd, 79 pounds of black and rich amber, the saddle across his back gone dark as wet iron and grizzling early at the muzzle. He'd been a combat tracker, and the right ear carried a ragged notch where shrapnel had clipped it, and a pale seam ran down one foreleg where he'd been opened and sewn shut in a field hospital in Helmand. He moved with the clean, deliberate confidence of an animal that had learned the difference between noise and meaning, and never wasted himself on the former. He didn't bark at the coyotes. He didn't startle at thunder. In 11 months on the wash, he had alerted exactly twice, and both times there had been a rattlesnake where he said there was one. He was routine and warning system and witness, and in the long cold nights in the camper, he was the closest thing to family Nora had let herself keep. The storm had come through at 3:40 the morning of the find, a rare hard January system that dumped an inch of cold rain on ground that could not hold it and sent a wall of black water down Dead Mule Wash for the first time in years. It scoured the wash to bedrock in places. It was cold enough that Nora's breath hung inside the camper, cold enough that Scout had whined and pressed against her in the dark, and by dawn the arroyo smelled of wet creosote and turned earth, and, faintly, of iron and rot, and something older than either. The light came up thin and hard over the basin, the tin roofs of Alkali Springs a mile off catching it flat and gray, and the only sound in the whole cold world was a dog digging, and, under that, the slow tick of water finding its level in a hole that had been sealed for a century. By noon, Nora had cleared enough of the clay to understand what she was looking at, and her hands were not steady. It was a mud wagon, a light desert stagecoach, the kind that had run mail and express on the remote southern routes long after the railroads killed the rest. The flash flood had undercut the bank and dropped the whole thing out of the wall of the wash where it had lain buried since the ground swallowed it. And wedged under the driver's box, bound in rusted iron straps and a padlock gone to lace, was a Wells Fargo and Company treasure box. Scout stood over it. He did not dig anymore. He looked at the box, and then he looked at her, and then he took 2 slow steps backward and lay down flat in the mud, beside a second thing the water had bared, a curve of bone and a boot, and the brass buttons of a coat that had gone to rags a very long time ago. There was a man in the wash with the gold. There had been, for 100 years. Clifton Rourke owned nearly everything a person could see from the rim of that basin, and had made certain over 30 years that everyone knew it. He was 58, silver at the temples, soft in the hands, and hard everywhere it didn't show. And Rourke Cattle Company ran 40,000 acres that wrapped the Ellison claim on 3 sides like a fist around a stone. His grandfather had founded the town. His name was on the road, the rodeo grounds, and the bronze plaque outside the courthouse that told the town's official history the way the Rourkes had always told it. He held paper on half the businesses on Main Street, and the county sheriff, a heavy, incurious man named Dale Pruitt, had been elected 3 times on Rourke money and understood precisely what that money expected in return. Men who had crossed Clifton Rourke had lost grazing leases and water permits and, in one case a decade back, a small mining claim on the north end of the basin that Rourke had wanted and gotten after the old prospector who held it gave up and left the state. Rourke did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. "This basin has one history," he liked to say, tapping the courthouse plaque with one manicured finger, "and I'm the one who keeps it." Ada Whitfield had lived with the other history for 81 years. She was the retired school teacher and the preacher's widow, and the closest thing Alkali Springs had to a memory, a small, straight-backed black woman who still walked to the Little Aim Church every Sunday and paid her account at the feed store to the exact dollar and would not, under any circumstances, accept a ride she hadn't asked for. Her grandfather had been Elias Whitfield, and in the autumn of 1924, Elias Whitfield had driven the last express run out of Alkali Springs, carrying a mine payroll in Wells Fargo gold, and he had never come back. The coach had never been found. The gold had never been found. And the story the town had settled on, the story the Rourkes had helped it settle on, was that the colored driver had robbed the box and run for Mexico, and left a good white shotgun messenger dead in the desert. Ada had grown up under that story the way you grow up under a low ceiling. She had never once believed it. She kept her grandfather's photograph on the mantel and his name in her mouth and his Bible on her nightstand, and she had told her own grandchildren, quietly and without heat, that the truth was patient, and that God did not lose things the way men did. She twisted her wedding band around a finger gone thin with the years whenever the old shame came near her. Around and around, and she never let anyone see it cost her anything. Nora did not touch the gold. She had spent enough of her life around things that were not what they appeared to be. She photographed the wagon and the box and the bones from 40 angles, marked the coordinates, and drove into Alkali Springs to do the thing the desert had raised her to do, which was to follow the chain of command. She went to the county library first, and it was there, in the local history room, that she met Ada Whitfield, because Ada volunteered there 3 days a week, and because when Nora laid a photograph of a hand-forged wheel rim on the reading table and asked the old woman if she knew anything about a stagecoach lost in the basin, Ada Whitfield went very still and put one thin hand flat on the table to steady herself. "Where?" Ada said. Not a question, a demand, 90 years in the asking. Nora told her, and Scout, who had followed her inside and lain down by the door the way he always did, got up without a sound, crossed the room, and sat down beside Ada Whitfield's chair, pressed against her leg, and would not be moved. Nora had never seen him do that with a stranger. Not once. Word travels fast in a town that size, and it reached the courthouse before Nora got home. Clifton Rourke did not come himself. He sent Sheriff Pruitt and 2 of his ranch hands out to Dead Mule Wash the next morning, and Pruitt stood on the rim with his thumbs in his belt and informed Nora Ellison that the wash was Rourke Range, that anything in it belonged to the man who owned the ground, and that a homeless woman squatting in a camper would be wise to hand over whatever she dug up before this became a criminal matter. He said it slow, the way men say things when they expect them to be enough. Nora looked at him for a moment. "This is a patented placer claim," she said. "Filed 1893. It's private property, and it's mine. That box and everything in it came out of my ground." She did not raise her voice. She never did. "That deed'll be real interesting to a judge," Pruitt said. "Mister, Rourke's got lawyers. You got a dog." He smiled at that. Behind him, Scout had gone dead still, ears flattened, watching the sheriff the way he watched things that had shown him what they were. A low sound came out of the dog, not a bark, barely a growl, and Pruitt's smile went a little uncertain. "Keep that animal back," he said. "He's fine where he is," Nora said. "You're the one standing on my land." Pruitt left, but he took her photographs of the bones with him as evidence, and that afternoon a Rourke Cattle Company backhoe rolled a gate closed across the county easement that was the only vehicle route to the wash, and a hand-lettered sign went up. "Private. No trespassing. Rourke." By evening, the county recorder's office had, very suddenly, been unable to locate the file that contained the Ellison patent. And Nora Ellison stood at the closed gate in the cold with her dog and understood, the way she had understood things in worse places than this, that the fight had already started and that she was, for the moment, losing it. They came for the site 3 nights later. Nora heard the diesel before she saw the lights, a lowboy trailer and an excavator, Rourke's hands moving in the dark to pull the coach and the box out of the wash before any deed or any judge could matter. Because possession, Clifton Rourke had always understood, was 9/10 of a story. Pruitt's cruiser sat up on the rim with its lights off. And in the camper Nora sat very still in the dark, with her hand on Scout's neck, and felt the old cold clarity settle over her, the one from the worst nights of her life, and thought about the man in the wash who had died protecting a box he could have run with, and about an 81-year-old woman who had carried his name like a stone for 8 decades, and she made a decision quietly and without saying it out loud. Scout felt it move through her and lifted his head. She had not lost. She had only been waiting for them to commit. Because Nora Ellison had not spent those 3 days grieving. She had a satellite phone and a contact list most drifters do not carry. She had already called the Arizona State Historic Preservation Office and the Bureau of Land Management's Law Enforcement Division, and an FBI agent she'd served alongside who now worked art and antiquities crime out of Phoenix. And she had reported 100-year-old human remains and a historic Wells Fargo shipment being actively looted from private property. All of it. Every call, logged and time-stamped. And in the bottom of the treasure box, sealed under the coins in an oilcloth pouch that the desert had kept dry. She had found the last thing Clifton Rourke could not afford to have found, Elias Whitfield's waybill, signed and countersigned, and folded inside it 3 pages of a letter the dying man had written in pencil, naming the 2 masked riders who had run the coach into the wash and shot the messenger, and naming the man who sent them. O'Rourke, the founder, the one on the plaque. They arrived at the wash at first light, all of them at once. On the morning Rourke's crew had the coach half out of the ground. The BLM law enforcement rangers came down the easement first with a federal warrant that made Rourke's gate a felony rather than a fence. The state archaeologist came behind them, and the FBI agent behind her, and 2 Department of Public Safety troopers who did not answer to Dale Pruitt behind them. And behind all of them, having refused 3 times to be left at the camper, came Nora Ellison and her dog, and Ada Whitfield in her grandfather's memory and her Sunday coat, because Nora had driven 40 miles the night before to bring her. Scout went first. That was how it happened, and half the county would tell it that way afterward, as Clifton Rourke came striding down off the rim in his good coat to take control of a situation he had never once in his life failed to control. The dog crossed the wash at a slow, deliberate walk, and put himself between Rourke and the open coach, between the living man and the dead one, and stood there. Not lunging, not barking, simply immovable. 79 pounds of scarred muscle and amber eyes fixed on Rourke's face with an attention that needed no translation. Rourke stopped. The whole cold basin seemed to stop with him. Then Nora spoke. And she was calm, and her calm was the most frightening thing in the wash. She told them who she was first, because not one of them had ever bothered to ask. Sergeant First Class, United States Army Special Forces, retired, 2 combat deployments. She said it flat, the way she'd once read grid coordinates, and she watched it land. Then she told them what was in the ground. She handed the state archaeologist the waybill and its evidence sleeve, and the FBI agent the 3 penciled pages. And she read the town its true history out loud in the thin morning light. The ambush, the murdered messenger, the driver who took 2 rounds and still drove the coach off the road into the wash to keep the gold out of the killer's hands, and died in the dark writing down their names, so the truth would outlast him. She named the riders, then she named the man who had sent them, and she looked at Clifton Rourke while she said it, and she gave him the one thing the Army had taught her to give even an enemy, once. "You can stand here and let these people do their jobs," she said quietly. "Or you can make it worse. Those are the only 2 roads you've got left." Rourke did what men with power almost always do. He reached for it. His voice climbed, and he told them it was a forgery, a squatter's stunt, that he'd have every badge in that wash unemployed by Monday, that they did not know who he was. He got most of it out. He did not finish, because the FBI agent was already reading him the federal statute on the trafficking of protected antiquities and human remains, and the DP's troopers had already turned to Dale Pruitt, whose part in the closed gate and the missing deed was about to become its own long story, and the state archaeologist was standing over the coffin the wash had made with tears standing in her eyes. Rourke looked around for the faces that had deferred to him for 30 years. He found the ranch hands looking at their boots. He found Ada Whitfield looking at him, not with hatred, which would have been a kind of gift, but with the terrible patient stillness of a woman who had known the truth for 81 years and had simply been waiting for the desert to give it back. A woman near the rangers put her hand over her mouth. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. Nora did not gloat. That was the thing Ada would tell people about, more than the gold, for the rest of her life. The soldier had every right to stand in that wash and enjoy what she had done, and she didn't. She stepped back and let the federal people work. And when it was done, she walked over to the old woman, and the two of them stood at the edge of the wash and looked down at what was left of Elias Whitfield, who had kept faith with a box of gold and a town that never deserved him. And Nora took off her faded ball cap and held it against her chest, and said, "He didn't run, ma'am. He never ran. He was here the whole time." 8 months later, the October sun came down warm and gold over the Alkali Basin, and the Little Aim Church could not hold the crowd. The coach and the Wells Fargo box went to the Arizona History Museum in Tucson, where they sit today behind glass with Elias Whitfield's name on the placard, and his story told true at last. The gold, a little over 60 pounds of 1924 double eagles, was ruled the property of the Ellison claim, and Nora, who had slept in a camper for 11 months, gave more than half of it away. A trust for the church, a scholarship in Elias Whitfield's name at the county high school, and a working ranch outside town, bought quiet and deeded to a foundation, where veterans who came home carrying the same silence Nora carried can sit in the shade and put their hands to honest work. She kept enough to fix the camper into a real house on her family's ground, and no more. Clifton Rourke was indicted that spring on federal antiquities charges and a tangle of state counts that grew as investigators pulled on the thread of 30 years of quiet dealings. Rourke Cattle Company was in receivership by summer. His name came off the road in June, and the courthouse plaque was replaced in August, with one that tells the basin's history the way it actually happened. Dale Pruitt resigned before they could remove him, and the county has an honest sheriff now for the first time in a generation. Ada Whitfield stood at her grandfather's new headstone that gold October morning, a proper granite marker in the town cemetery, 102 years after he died in the wash. With the words he kept the trust cut deep beneath his name, and she did not cry, because she had never in her life been the kind of woman who cried where people could see. But she twisted her wedding band around and around, and when Scout came and pressed himself against her leg the way he had that first day in the library, she rested one thin hand in the thick fur of his neck and left it there. Nora watched from the edge of the cemetery with the desert opening gold and endless behind her. The steel in her neck still ached when the weather turned, and some nights were still long, and she did not pretend otherwise. But Scout was down among the graves now, gray coming into his muzzle, working the crowd of children who had come for the ceremony, letting them bury their hands in his coat, his notched ear up and his tail going slow and easy. A dog who had spent his life finding what was buried, and had finally, at the end of it, dug up something that set a whole town free. Nora Ellison had stopped waiting to feel like she was somewhere temporary. She had come home to the last ground that was hers, and it turned out to be the first ground she had ever truly chosen. She wasn't waiting for her life to begin. It already had. Sometimes the most valuable thing buried in the ground is not the gold. Sometimes it is the truth, lying in the dark exactly where it fell, waiting 100 years for someone patient enough to dig it up and brave enough to carry it into the light. God does not lose things the way men do. He keeps them, a name, a good man's honor, a promise made in pencil by a dying hand, and he keeps them safe until the flood comes and the ground gives way and the right soul is standing there to see. The world is not saved by the men whose names are carved on the plaques. It is saved, again and again, by the ones they wrote off and drove out and left in the cold, and by the loyal creatures who will not stop digging until the truth is bare. Sometimes all it takes is one who refuses to look away. If Elias and Ada's story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the truth is patient and that God keeps what men throw away. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if your own family has ever carried a name that deserved to be cleared, we would like to hear about it, because your story may be the light someone else has been praying for. And if you believe in loyalty, in justice that comes late but comes, and in the quiet courage of ordinary people and the dogs who walk beside them, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, keep faith with your name the way heaven kept faith with Elias Whitfield, and remind you always, you are never alone.